Haia, ka pai, ka pai. Kia ora no tātou. We thought it'd be nice to do this little session now and then have a cup of tea and kia no. I've got some notes here. He rā rere whitinga te rā. Which reminded me that whakanoa is a good way for us to complete our day. And so, kia ora, Hera, Betty. Really, both of your kōrero really framed a little bit of what I wanted to share now, following on from the tikanga kōrero around whakatauki, whakatauaki and whakawai. Whakawai is the kupu no taranaki for whakatauki. And both Hera and Betty use particular phrases through their kōrero that they both used in ways that were just part of the languaging. So Hera, when you said Hera anō, and we take that as a whakatauki, but it was just part of your languaging. And I think this is something about whakamai, whakatauki, whakatauaki that we need to bring into our lives as just a part of how we talk and not separating them out as something quite separate to how we are. The other one, he toka tūmwana, Hera just rolled off in her kōrero. And Betty talked about sacred spaces and that space of vā and all of those ways of being. So one of the things we did in the whakawhiti kōrero and the hui is that we invited people to share whakatauki or whakatauaki or sayings that they had written that they use in their everyday practices. And so we just wanted to share, and then we asked them what those meant for them in their mahi. Because one of the things about using, I'll just use whakatauki instead of all the three names for now, but in using and utilising whakatauki, it's actually about the application of that in our lives and the practice of those and the informing of those. And one of the things we've been doing in the past few projects is creating whakatauki books, and you saw the Whakawai book outside that we did with Tūtama Wahine, which were sayings from Taranaki, both traditional sayings but also lines out of karakia, and also writing new whakatauki hou, which we've been reminded by many of our people. And as I was saying with Huirangi the other day, that karakia, we don't have to wait for the 8 o'clock karakia. You can sit up and do your own karakia, and whatever means that is. You don't have to wait for the gathering to do it. And so the same with whakatauki and whakatauaki, encouraging us to bring these contemporary ones. And I know that some mātanga reo have been doing those, but we can do these in our everyday lives. And so in those puka that we've been putting together, and your Hinemo elder has done Aroha, and she's done a new one, Wawata, I believe, which is her thinking about whakatauki in ways that are healing in her space. And so we've done a number of these in the mahi we've done. Takukuru Pounamu we did as a part of a small project we did on raising tamariki, kaupapa Māori nei, and we've just extended that as part of the mahi with Tūtama Wahine to a new book called Poi Poi Ana Tamariki that will be ready in a couple of months' time, which is now 60 whakatauki around that give us guidance around raising tamariki. And we don't say parenting tamariki, because he whakaaro pākete that only parents, and actually we've had many examples of the many people that raise us and raise our tamariki. Whether they are nearly perfect or perfect. Rose Petty would remind us that we are all born perfect. We only become imperfect when compared to others. So I agree with Joe's kōrero earlier about not just the near brilliance, but the incredible Indigenous Māori Pacific brilliance in this room. So whakatauki, and this is just a general kōrero around how we bring these together and what they are about in terms of giving us instruction, guidance, support, speaking to us across time and generations, being a way of communing, of communication, a whole range of things. Hinemo talks about whakatauki as nuggets of wisdom that provide life lessons, guidance, notes of caution, he kōrero whakatūpato, wetahi. Sometimes a source of comfort. So the multiple layers of whakatauki and what they mean for us. And so a lot of people had a lot to say around whakatauki as being guidance in their daily lives, and the need for us to bring that back in to our spaces. And in the webinar series we did for He Waka Eke Noa, I talked a little bit about this, and I drew on the whakatauki that we had used in Takukuru Pounamu in particular. But this one I just wanted to share some whakatauki that whānau shared themselves, that they use, or sayings, so not all whakatauki, but other forms of sayings or whakaaro that they use to inform their well-being. We've talked about what He Waka Eke Noa as a whakatauki. Another whakatauki we've been using in our mahi, ka mua ka muri, looking to our past to move forward, which is really what everyone's been talking about in the past few days around tikanga, mātauranga reo, being informed by our past, drawing on the knowledge of our tupuna to create ways forward. All of these whakaaro in terms of bringing whakatauki into our daily lives, into our practice lives. And I was also thinking, Betty, around when you were talking about how we take responsibility and how we think about what we need to do to change in our own lives. And I think the whakatauki can give us a whole lot of insights, like this whare. I was watching Heather around the whare, and I had some trigger moments of relationships thinking, interesting, I wish I'd had that whare at certain times in my life. And probably in the future. But, ka mua ka muri, that constant reflection that we're doing around how our lives are and how we're informed and how we contextualise those. So some of the kōrero that came from whānau, some of the ones that we know are obvious, but people talk about these really inform their lives and how they live their lives. Aroha ki te tangata, aroha ki te tangata. And when Bessie talked about when someone walks in the room, we should assume the matai. Hey, we should assume the matai. And so we should assume, and we know, and we expect that all of our people are rangatira. It's like when we talk about that we are all born with mana. Mana is not selective. Mana is mai ngā atua. Mana is mai ngā kāwai whakapapa. The mana that we carry is the mana of our tupuna and it's the mana of our mokopuna. And so when Heather was talking about that focus in terms of mokopuna and the quantitative kōrero with Shirley, what's the focus? Mokopuna. Tamariki mokopuna. That being cognizant of that mana. We've been going through the mana wahine tribunal and we've just finished the 6th tuapapa hearing before the big hearings begin. And this question is, iaha tēnei mea te mana is constantly coming up. Do we all have mana? How does mana manifest? Is there such a thing as mana enhancing? Is something that's been coming up lately. I mean, how do you enhance someone else's mana when it's actually not yours to enhance? And so when we've been talking around the crown and we're asked, can the crown diminish mana? Well, actually, no, they can't. Because an external force cannot diminish your kāwai whakapapa. The mana mai ngā tupuna, the mana mai ngā atua. Only we can do things that impact on our mana. By our actions, by our behaviours, by how we're seen, how we enable ourselves, how we practice ourselves. But the Crown can, as we've heard with the structural kōrero, put all of the barriers in place to our exercising of our mana, to our exercising of our mana motuhaki, to our exercising of our rangatiratanga in daily ways. They can barrier these things. So, all through the kōrero, people would talk about these kinds of saying, aroha ki te tangata. Utilising tikanga in terms of thinking about what does aroha mean. What does aroha ki te tangata mean? What are those tikanga around our interactions? Do we assume that everyone that walks in the room is rangatira? Do we assume that everyone that walks in and every interaction we're having is an affirmation of each other's mana? Because that's what I got a lot from Heather's kōrero, those interactions with each other. The interactions with understanding te reo and the space of te reo. And mokopuna having a voice in whatever language is their language. And it's the same with Beti in terms of talking around the languaging of how we talk about things. So aroha ki te tangata. Mō tātou a mō ka uri a muri ake nei. The thing around the whakatauki that came up all the time was that there was a constant reminder of relationships. That's the thing that really came up. When we said to people, what whakatauki do you draw on? What whakatauki do you seek to live? What whakatauki do you bring into your practice? Most of them were about relationships, either tangata ki te tangata ki te taiao, tangata ki te whenua, whenua ki te tangata. Mokopuna, uri whakahiki, tamariki, living our lives in a way that for future generations, the world will be different, will be transformed from some of our experiences. And what we've learned in education is that virtually every generation of our people has sought to make it better for the next generation, has sought to make something stronger, sought to make something more regenerated, sought to make something more transforming, more well for the next generation. It's a constant thing that comes through all of the kōrero. He mokopuna, he tupuna, te mokopuna. We've heard this a lot, and we heard the kōrero that Marama shared in terms of the whakatauki, and that kōrero coming from Uncle Chiki, Raumati, in terms of mokopuna, and this coming too from that relationship of we are all mokopuna and we are all tupuna simultaneously. And when we think about the work by people, Native American, Indigenous scholars like Karina Walters and Bonnie, who's working with us, they say this all of the time. I stand here as the grandchild of my grandparent and the grandparent of my grandchild yet to come. We are mokopuna and tupuna simultaneously. That is the realm of whakapapa as it moves intergenerationally. And so when people have been talking about the intergenerational healing and the need for the long-term healing, that is about the long-term healing is not necessarily about waiting 10 or 20 years. The long-term healing is standing within us. One of the things that came up in the historical trauma work, which this whakatauki, this whakawai in particular, has always resonated with, is have we taken the time to heal our tupuna, to heal the trauma of our tupuna, so that it doesn't continue to be passed through our ira tangata, through our whakapapa. And these are understandings that we're never going to find in a psychology book, you know. Ira tangata. And when we looked at genetic engineering work with some of our kuia and karaua many years ago, one of the things that they would always say is he wānanga tō te ira. Every ira has its own inherent wānanga. So you remove one of those, you're removing a whole wānanga. You should tūpato. Kia tūpato. So if we are mokopuna and tupuna simultaneously in that, have we thought about, because this is a lot of movement in terms of a lot of the indigenous mahi being done, is that the healing is not only about healing the present and the future, it's of a healing of the past. And many iwi are doing that. Parihaka have been doing that, bringing different ways of healing. So it's not just healing of now, but what we carry is both the trauma and the brilliance of our tupuna. So we should be expounding the near perfect and the perfect, and we should be utilising that to healing the trauma of our tupuna. And when we look at some of the historical trauma work in the States, in Turtle Island, a lot of that healing is almost like having a tangi for that trauma. And I'm laying this out with you because you are the practitioners of this mahi. But when I read that, I think it's like they're having a tangi for the trauma of that tupuna. So I'm going to lay that. I muri te arawara o tēnei whare o hera. Kei a koutou te tikanga. You know? He tangata, he atua. See, they're very similar. He tangata, he atua. This is something Rose Perry always said. He atua, he tangata, he tangata, he atua. And that's the sacredness that Perry's talking about. It's the sacredness that we've all talked about when we talk about tapu and mana. It's whakapapa, that inherent to all of us is ira atua. We descend from atua. So we should all expect that when we walk in the room we are rangatira. Because we carry that context and that whakapapa kōrero with us every day. So we stand here as tupuna, we stand here as rangatira, we stand here as atua. Who is it for anyone to transgress that, to attempt to diminish that? Ngā tōroro, ngā tōku roro. So these are not whakatauki that are not known commonly. And people would talk about their own stories, and this one, it was really about the way in which we're meant to share, create balance, bring equal, bring in ways of what Graham talked about in his principles, kia pikiaki, ngā raruraru o te kāinga. Nā tōroro, nā tōku roro, kia ora ai te iwi. And what this particular person talked about is actually about remembering in her work that people bring in their roro not just the bad things, not just the negative things, but also the incredible positive things, the sharing, and the ways of bringing goodness too. And that came up in the kōrero that Denise talked about, actually, quite a lot, that Denise talked about, and that you all know in your mahi. Ko tōku reo ka tuku, ko tōku reo ka ora. Te reo Māori as rongoa. Te reo Māori as rongoa is constant throughout the kōrero that people shared. Tikanga as rongoa. Te reo Māori as rongoa. That thriving of who we are, that form of flourishing in who we are. And in the quantitative material, even though it showed that the reo was like on the 10th on the scale, it was still like 60%. So we're not talking about small numbers here, we're talking about large numbers. But there were all of these things that actually come with Te Reo Māori. So Mātauranga Māori brings Te Reo Māori. And we know that Te Reo Māori, as Heather so clearly showed us today, brings with it all of these ways of creating spaces that are not created in other forms that sit outside of our tikanga and our mātauranga and our reo. And in terms of that, the reo is seen as rongoa, ko tōku reo ka ora. So it's not just the thriving of te reo Māori, but the thriving of us as reo Māori people. That's a part of who we are. Whether we know, whether we speak, whether we understand, it is an inherent part of who we are. And reo is also voice. It's not just language, it's also voice. And when we hear talking today around those rangatahi, is that it wasn't just that people could not communicate with them, that the people could not participate with them, that the people could not engage with them, but that in doing that, they weren't getting their reo, their own voice of language. This one, I remember seeing this one when it came up in our group kōrero around this particular whakatauki, and I thought, gosh, how do you use that whakatauki in the healing whānau one? Because it's always been one of these struggle ones, get out there and do the battle, kind of. But what they talked about, when they talked about, the particular kai kōrero talked about this whakatauki, was actually in the context of the many difficulties and tararu, of constantly struggling through, of not stopping, of keeping fighting through. So it wasn't necessarily about fighting others, which is kind of how I see a lot of struggle. And this is often used in a lot of kind of protest and that kind of context. But they were talking about your own struggle, not giving up in what you were doing to make things, to achieve what whānau wanted, keeping striving forward in that context. So the way in which sometimes we may think about whakatauki ourselves is not necessarily the guidance and the learning that someone else might get in their context. And when we talked about multiple ways of thinking about pūrākau, and the ways in which we think about pūrākau, similarly in the ways in which we think about whakatauki and whakatauaki, that there are multiple learnings in a particular context that may be different from another context. The ngako will be the same, but the learnings in the context may slightly differ. So that when we apply these, we're applying them within a context and we're thinking about them within a context. So this was like, don't give up easily. It's worth doing the work. It's worth reconstructing the whare, no matter how long it might take you to build it, no matter how hard it might get to get the foundations right, no matter how long it might take and how many people it might take to re-erect the walls, and no matter how many carved fronts get taken away, another one will come in time. So, that's the thing. And when we think of all of the struggles we've done, and I just keep saying parata sitting there, and the struggle that was such a long struggle for Ngāti Whātua, of one, because the struggle is the same for Te Atiawa, it's the same for Taranaki, it's the same for Ngāpuhi. I mean, we've all got these struggles that have been going for such a long period of time, but it's worth the wait. It's worth the struggle. It's worth the perseverance. It's worth the mate ururoa in the long term. And this one really resonated with, there's a lot of people who kōrero around whānau, and we know that the healing that we're doing is whānau-based, ainga-based, that we're moving away from this total separation, siloed idea. That doesn't mean that we don't have to have safety mechanisms, okay, so we're not doing any of that. But that mahi ngātahi, hikoi ngātahi, haere ngātahi, moving together, shifting things together, transforming things together, in whatever way that might be. Sometimes it is separation. Sometimes that is the resolution. Sometimes it's not the resolution. Sometimes it's about moving out of entrapment. Sometimes it's about doing different strategies to change that. And the fence, I thought Graham did a lovely job this morning when he brought up the way in which we talked about prevention and intervention, the fence and the ambulance. Okay? And the fence as boundaries that people talked about as boundaries. We have many fences in Te Ao Māori, and there's a whole fence analogy I think that we're yet to get to. Right? Pātū watawata. What were the palisades that we had around our pā? And what were they for? And what was their role? I mean, there are many fences, and I think that there's a whole whakaaro and kōrero in that thing of boundaries, the way in which we think about boundaries. Because it's not a Western notion of boundaries, because we didn't cut up everything. We didn't slice it up. We didn't make it into tidy little quarter-acre sections. We didn't try and tidy it up, our taiao. Like Donna Awatiri said in her book, Māori Sovereignty, which is very old and very hard to get now. But, you know, that sectioning of whenua became a mowed lawn mentality. It became a mowed lawn mentality. And a mowed lawn mentality was about our control over the environment. Our control, our assumption of our control over the taiao. Our assumption of our control over the atua within the taiao. So moving ourselves, and Graham's kind of peanutty thing where he goes, it's about this long. Moving ourselves out of that thinking. That's a kind of, and I've always loved that phrase, a mowed lawn mentality. But mahi ngātahi. Utua te kino ki te pai. Again, something that we know, something that is a part of many of our own iwi whakatauki, something that's a part of some of our more tiatia. And when I see this one in particular, utua te kino ki te pai, it always reminds me of Cooney Jenkins. Because it reminds me of her kōrero about Hukarere Girls' School, utua te kino ki te pai. And she would talk about this a lot as a whakaaro around dealing with issues that are raised. What those issues? Some of us are not so good at utua te kino ki te pai. Some of us still utua te kino ki te kino. But, it's a learning to have. And then so what we've done is then think about those. Those are just some examples. I wanted to keep this very brief so that we can actually do what we need to do to bring the hui to a close. But I just wanted to talk really briefly about the applications. And so this is something that we've been looking at, people who are talking about how we apply whakatauki and whakatauaki in our mahi and why they're important. So on one, they offer a glimpse of a different paradigm of living as being an individual and a whānau that counters the narrative of whānau as being socially deficit. Okay? As being socially deficit. Ringaropa, showing the blisses, showing the mahi you do, all of those things. They reinforce the notion that whānau are not alone, and that collective whanaungatanga is meant to be a source of thrivance, safety and growth across generations. And so many of our whakatauki are intergenerational, and they remind us of things, and some of them we can't source, some of them we can. Whakatauaki we can, whakatauki we can't necessarily source. So they've been with us, for many of them, for many generations. Counter the myth that whānau as a collective is an unnatural way to survive or thrive, or that individuals within whānau are not expected to take responsibility. There are so many whakatauki that are actually about obligation, responsibility, and positionality. He atua he tupuna is responsibility. It's not just about the fact that we're all perfect and that we're all atua inherently, but it's about what that means. What that means in terms of responsibility and obligations and accountability and actions. Provide diverse learnings about living within a collective in an ethical way that has intergenerational consequences. In an ethical way. And when we talked about ata being something that we've been using a lot within kaupapa Māori from Taina, and Heather talked about takipu, ahori te tera, that they are sources of mātāpono, of philosophies. Some of them are heavier than others. Some of them have kite and some don't. But ata, Taina always talked about as a fundamentally an ethical behavioural model. Ata whakaaro. And it's not just to think, but it's to think very deeply, intentionally, consciously, awarely. Right? All of those things. Ata kōrero. It's not just speak, but it's about speaking in a particular way. Speaking carefully, remembering the mana of the receiver of your words, being intentional and deliberate, taking the time to think. These are all ethical, he would say, ethical behavioural ways of being and interacting. And they are not easy in a colonised space. We have to relearn, many of us have to relearn them. Some of us inherently do this, I think, because of the knowledge that we've had as we've grown up and the people who have influenced us. But I think many of us are having to relearn that, to rethink that. It's not just to kōrero, but remember that when you kōrero, there's someone receiving that. So ata kōrero, ata whakarongo, those things. And that's why ata is such an important way of thinking, and why this kind of whakaaro around whakatauki and whakatauaki is that they give us ethical considerations and ways of being. There are ancestral instructions that are not tainted by a therapeutical or punitive practice. That's a Linda Smithism. But are powerfully the direct words of our ancestors. So they are directly from our tupuna. And what we write today, I'd say we all need to go and compose our whakatauki for our mokopuna. It's like we need to compose our oriori for our mokopuna. Oriori didn't stop in the 1800s because mokopuna didn't stop being born. And tamateki in there. And some people in this room I know have composed oriori. And I know Hini Wirangi wrote a little book on how you can compose your own oriori. And most recently, Paraone Gloin has written an oriori for any whānau in Waikato Tainui that wish to use it as an oriori for their tamaiti. And that to bring back the practice is something that Waingata talked about when we talked to him around Tiaki Tamariki, oriori. Start telling our histories back to our tamariki and mokopuna in the way we want them told to them. They're a communication with ancestors between us and them. It enables us to reach out to the ancestors and touch their minds. They can form the basis of a curriculum, of a program, a way to structure content and practices that can be offered against preventative intervention and healing spaces. And there are many people here who draw on whakatauki for exactly that purpose. But one whakatauki alone can create an entire curriculum. One alone. He rā anō. He rā anō just always reminds me of how impatient I am. That I think it's got to be done today. The decision has to be made now. It's got to be done now. Rather than actually thinking, maybe we need to reflect on this for a little bit longer. He rā anō. He rā ki tua, te tai atu, momo whakatauki. Taking that time to reflect. And they can be structured to offer values frameworks, decision-making, problem-solving, leadership frameworks, and future-focused frameworks. The question at the end of the quantitative piece that we did around what's important for future, we really didn't want to finish the survey just in the now. We wanted to get a sense of what else do we have to do as we move forward for well-being. And one of the areas that you can see is that there are multiple layers is around incarceration. And we thought around that question, ideally, we want to remove all prisons. I mean, that's kind of our team approach. But we couldn't have that as the only option for our people, because sometimes there are other steps that people need to do toward that. So abolishing prisons was one, but reducing incarceration was also another one. And ensuring wellbeing programs was also another one. So that there were options as we move forward, what Graham was saying, those incremental changes. And one thing he didn't say today that I thought he normally says is that we should celebrate every single one of them. We should celebrate every single one of them for ourselves, not for anyone else. We should not be thanking the Crown for it, but we should be celebrating it for ourselves, because that gives us our momentum to the next change and the next change. And an affirmation that really things they have changed. But they haven't changed because the state has made them change. They've changed because we have all made them change. Every single positive change initiative for Māori has been driven by Māori. Everything. Kohanga, kura, in spite of the system. In spite of that, we've driven forward with them. Kaupapa Māori services, driven by Māori providers. Kaupapa Māori education, driven by whānau. Te reo Māori, driven by Māori. So all of these have been driven by us, and so we are looking at something really very future-focused that draws on the past, ka muri ka mua, in order to move forward in the spaces that we're in. And we've been very fortunate as a part of this mahi to have been working alongside so many practitioners that are doing such amazing work. And our job as the researchers in the team is to document it so that evidence that they say you don't have, you have. And that evidence is for every single Māori organisation and provider in this sector to use as you see fit. As you see fit for your mahi. To create spaces, to open doors, to argue back. And so it will be actively and readily available to all of you and all of the other Māori providers that we've worked with to actually utilise and draw upon in whatever way works for you. So I want to leave the project component there. I just want to say that we are, when the report is written and printed, we bring it back. So we will be back here in Otautahi. We also went to Whakatū in the workshop round, so we'll go back there. We'll bring the report back, and so we'll be working with Te Puna Oranga around facilitating that, and taking it to the other regions that we visited with as well, to take it back and to hand it over. And I've asked Parata and Laurie if we can go to Kaikoura, because I really want to go to Kaikoura. And my children and I booked a trip to Kaikoura, and then the earthquake happened. So, but also we want to go to other areas within Te Waipounamu. We're very cognisant that often research done sits in the north, in Tika Māui, and doesn't get on this waka. So we're making sure that this comes back again with BJ and all the team. I want to acknowledge, before Here Aoha closes, Te Puna Oranga, again, for the ongoing support. I want to acknowledge Tūtama Wahine o Taranaki, who are my new bosses, and they treat me fabulously. And it's so lovely not to be in an institution anymore. All of the kai kōrero that came and shared with all of us, and the research team itself on behalf of Linda and I. And I want to acknowledge Bernie. So Bernie is very quietly sitting in the back, Bernadette Lee, but Bernie is our project manager with Lotaki, who was really instrumental. I can see she's hiding. To this hui, and working with Te Puna Oranga, with the hui, Apanui, who is constantly here with us to support not just us, but particularly Tana Hoa Wahine, and Hiri Aroha, who's facilitated an incredible sessions, shown us what pao and karanga can do in our learning spaces, even in Samoan, and, you know, very grateful for all of your participation and for the mahi done by all of you to bring this hui to fruition. Kia koutou katoa I huihui mai nei I runga I tēnei whenua